Hey everybody, Tall Family Films here. Today we are doing the front brakes, the rotor and the pads on a 2007 Nissan Titan, but this procedure is pretty generic. It definitely would be the same for any Nissan, but it'll be the same for a whole lot of cars as well. So let's dig right in. So this is on the passenger side. We're going to replace this rotor because I get this shaking feeling when in the steering wheel when I'm slowing down. That's caused by some warpness in the rotor. So normally, if we were just doing the pads, I would not have to remove the entire bracket. I would just remove the two bolts, or one of them, I'm sorry, the one bolt that holds the top of the caliper in, and it would just flap open, and then I can access the pads, pull them out, and replace them. But since I have to replace this rotor, this entire assembly, the whole front of this bracket and everything has to come off of the rotor. So there's two 17mm bolts that hold this piece in place. So there's one here on the top, and then there's a matching one on the bottom that is hard to get a good camera angle on, but it looks identical to that one. All right, I've moved the camera up top so we can get a good view of the bolt and when we go to remove it here. There is just enough room in here for me to get an impact gun on this. If you turn the wheel left or right, you will provide more room for yourself, so just remember that. So that's all that holds the bracket on. So the entire caliper comes loose now. You do not want to let it hang by that brake cable, so keep a good grip on it when you're removing it from the rotor. And a little trick that I was taught that works very well is to grab a bungee cord and just run it through the caliper, make sure that it's attached securely to the caliper, and then run it up through the strut or the shock on the truck as well. And that's pretty much it. Rotor just comes right off. Let me just pause here for a second and mention that not all rotors just come right off like this. So some cars require you to remove a very large screw, looks just like this. So you need to take a screw out first. All right, so got the new rotor. I have to say this one looks pretty cool. So I got these off Amazon. I'll put in the link to exactly which ones I used. Amazon had the best price. And here's the pads that I used. This all came in a kit with new rotors and pads. There's the part number if you're looking for it. Inside this kit had quite a few things actually that normally I'm not used to seeing when I buy new pads. But this kit came with new boots, came with new shims that hold the pads in, keeps them from clanging when you're stopping, and also with grease or lubricant to put on the backs of the pads and around the bolts, and of course the pads themselves. Okay, so it's time to reattach the bracket, and once we do that we'll be able to more easily change the pads. So putting the bracket back on, there is nothing obviously complicated about it. The trick you do need to know here is that it will not fit back on the new rotor with the old pads in place because the old rotor was thinner. So you need to knock these pads out. Pretty easy to do here. So I just used one of the bolts that I had laying on the ground, and you just simply knock the old pad out. Sometimes they're not stuck at all. Sometimes they fall out. But I always put lubricant on the back of the pads, which makes them a little bit sticky on the back, so that keeps them from rubbing on the rotors when you're driving down the road. So I'm putting Loctite on the bolts that are going to hold the bracket back in. I always suggest you use Loctite on critical components, things you don't want to back out by themselves. That would include your brakes, I hope. Okay, so now it's just like doing a normal brake job. So there's some smaller bolts that are on the back side of the caliper. And when we remove those, the caliper on most cars just sort of flops open. Sometimes the brake cable's too tight and you have to go from the bottom or remove both bolts. But this one has enough slack in it, so it'll work perfectly. You'll see just how easy doing a brake job is. So I'm going from memory here, but I'm pretty sure this was a 14mm bolt. I don't think they put a smaller one on there. And you can see the caliper just kind of flops open. This bolt was actually pretty tough to get out, and if you take a look at it here, you'll see that it had old Loctite on there. It was actually Loctite, the red Loctite, which is even harder to get moving than the blue. All right, so there's too much tension on the brake cable if I just let this hang down on its own, because the brake cable is what would be supporting it. So I'm going to tie up the caliper so that it doesn't put too much pressure on there. Okay, so now that we have access to the caliper, I'm going to take an old brake pad and compress these back inside. So you need to do that because you won't have, the caliper just won't go on with the new pads. It's a physical problem. So I use a large C-clamp. It's what I've always done. Just find some room on the back side of the caliper and then just slowly compress this back in. You need to loosen the reservoir, the brake reservoir, the fluid reservoir up inside the engine, because you're going to be backing fluid up. If you think about it, you're compressing that caliper back inside, which is going to take space that is currently occupied by fluid, and that's going to force the fluid back up into the reservoir, and it likely will overflow, especially if you're doing both sides. So you need to suck some out, check it regularly while you're tightening, get up and check to see what the level of the reservoir is, and either use a paper towel to soak some up, or a turkey baster to suck some out, or something underneath it to catch it when it drips. Brake fluid is corrosive, so you don't want it sitting on paint or on anything else inside your engine. So the C-clamp will get to a point where it pretty much just won't go any further, and you're actually hitting the metal of the caliper at that point. So you're done. You can actually see a visual right here. Those things are all the way back inside now. So that's what you're looking for. Then you're going to need to put, if they gave you new boots, you can put new boots on. I'm going to replace the boot on the top here because it's the one I have open. This caliper is only about 6 months old, so I'm not going to bother doing the boot on the bottom. But since this one is easily available to me, I'm going to do it here and just show you what that's like. It's very simple. You just simply pull the boot down. Sometimes if the boot is split, you won't get enough to grip it, so take a pair of pliers or something and just pull the old boot off. They do give you grease that you can use to grease that bolt before it goes back in. And although I didn't hear, because I had plenty of grease on that bolt, it never hurts to go ahead and use a little bit more grease on it. If your pads came with new shims, then now's the time to pull the old shims out. There's no trick to that. Just simply pull them and they usually come right out. Sometimes they get really stuck on there and I just tap them with a screwdriver, a flathead screwdriver, and they'll come right out. But anyways, get your new shims. Make sure you orient them correctly. Sometimes the shims on the bottom are different than the shims on the top, but just get the shim oriented the same way that the old one was. They won't go on wrong. You will not get the pads back in if the shim's not right, but you can line them up here to kind of see how the old one looked. Make sure it looks identical before you go trying to put it in, and snap it back in place. All right, so then the bottom shim is just the same. These shims are all identical actually. All right, so there's a squealer or a wear indicator, that little knob that sticks up. It needs to go on the bottom inner of this brake pad, inside the caliper bracket. So if the caliper bolted to the front of the rotor and not the rear like this one is, then you would put it on the top, outside. But this wear indicator, when the calipers are bolted onto the back of the rotor, the wear indicator goes on the bottom inside. So that's it for doing the brakes. I've applied Loctite to this bolt, and you should definitely do that too. All right, while I'm finishing up here, let me just tell you a couple of things. One is, if you're a little bit unsure about something you're about to do, take a picture of it. Take a movie of it before you do it with your phone, because then you'll at least know how to get back to the state that it was in. The second thing is, what I did off camera here was put disc brake quiet or a grease on the parts where the caliper touches the back of the pad. So I actually applied it to the spots on the caliper that touch the pads. You want to do that because remember earlier in the video where I had to knock the pads out? That's because they were stuck in there with that grease or that lubricant, or it's also called disc brake quiet, and it's usually red or blue at the auto parts store. Highly suggest doing that. I've used it for over 20 years, probably 30 years, and I have never had problems with the pads dragging on the rotor while the car is moving. All right, so you're done when you're at this point. So can I just say that I'd really appreciate it if you subscribe to my channel. It really helps me out a lot. Give this video a thumbs up if it's one that helped you out, and leave me any comments. I answer everything that people leave. Thank you very much.